Before beginning, it will be noted that this video is made by a Christian for a Christian audience. I will not be debating the historical realities of Jesus Christ, his divinity, or his status as the Son of the living God. This video's point is to prove that Ubisoft has a strong, recognizable bias against my religion and serves as a warning to all who call themselves followers of Christ that this series goes beyond the typical jabs the media takes at our religion. Instead, it prides itself on tarnishing the Word of God and the Church's teachings through the underhanded and latent means that it employs. With this said, it is time to begin the video. Assassin's Creed is a game very near and dear to my heart. These games were with me in the many ups and downs of my life, from trying to fit into school, to the deaths of my family, and even in the downtime of my busy adult life. Playing as Altair ibn Lahad, I was mystified and drawn into the tense and dark atmosphere of 12th century Syria. I felt the lively and beautiful Renaissance through Ezio Auditore da Firenze. The age of exploration and freedom were presented to me with the Kenway family. All these men helped me to deepen my knowledge of history and to delve deeper into what our ancestors have to offer us. Now, as an adult, I've realized something. The games I played growing up possess themes that I did not pick up on as a child. There is, strangely enough, a Gnostic and Luciferian underpinning to these games. What better place to begin than with the namesake of this series, the Assassin's Creed? Nothing is true, everything is permitted. And who better should explain the Creed's meaning than a man who served the Brotherhood for 36 years?
But it is merely an observation of the nature of reality. To say that nothing is true is to realize that the foundations of society are fragile, and that we must be the shepherds of our own civilization. To say that everything is permitted is to understand that we are the architects of our actions, and that we must live with their consequences, whether glorious or tragic.
The first part, I don't think anyone would really disagree with. Society is indeed fragile, as we have seen in recent years with the world facing a pandemic and economic decline. Society is something that must be fostered and upheld. How is this best carried out, though? By loving one another. Love your fellow man. Support your nation, and have pride in your people. There is nothing wrong with these things, and there should be no question as to their utility in fostering society, as Ezio puts it. The second half, everything is permitted, is another story. To say that we are the architects of our own actions, and that no outside force has any say, is an inherently Luciferian and esoteric belief. When reflecting on the Creed, a particular quote comes to mind. Quote, "Harm no one, do what thou wilt." These were the words of Aleister Crowley, a 20th century British esotericist and occultist whose work left a great impression upon the spirit of our age. This shallow philosophy has its roots as well in Wicca. Are the Creed and Crowley's belief a one-to-one? Perhaps not, but they most certainly are cut from the same cloth. They are cut from the same cloth as the humanistic and revolutionary thinking that the Enlightenment bred. Before getting into the bulk of this essay, it is necessary to define some key terms and ideas. Assassin's Creed takes a lot of inspiration from the Enlightenment. This was a time period from the late 1600s to the late 1700s, characterized by a rise in rational thinking, which was used to analyze what society had always taken for granted. Things such as religion, science, and government were all deconstructed, in a sense, by rational thinking. Religious institutions, such as the Roman Catholic Church of the Middle Ages, were no longer respected as they once were. Society came to believe that there was no divine right to rule as there once was. Instead, concepts like popular sovereignty, or the people's consent to rule, replaced the idea of a ruler being God's anointed. The Enlightenment is also where the scientific method really began to take off with notions of materialism, or that all things are material, and that if something exists, it must be able to be experienced with the five senses. If one cannot see, smell, taste, hear, or touch something, then it simply cannot be proven to exist. Humanism was the Enlightenment's predecessor from the 1500s. This was a belief characterized by the idea that man, entirely on his own, without the help of God or any other deity, could be moral, just, and righteous. Much like its successor, humanism tries to apply rationalism to all facets of life. It emphasized that humans are inherently morally good, and that society's goals should be aimed toward the common needs of one's fellow man. With some of these things explained, it is now time to really get into the meat of this video. Who are the Assassins and Templars? The Assassins and Templars have existed throughout history under multiple names and identities, but their core tenets and beliefs have always been preserved. The two have been at odds with one another since time immemorial and are considered sworn enemies. The two groups have been present in some capacity in every major civilization, trying to achieve their own goals. The Assassins place a strong emphasis on human freedom, dignity, democracy, and freedom from oppressive or tyrannical rule. There are three tenets. The Assassin's Creed guide them and serve as a sort of political and quasi-religious way of life. Those three tenets are: 1. Stay your blade away from the blood of an innocent. 2. Always remain discreet. And 3. Do not compromise the Brotherhood. The Assassins sound quite like the Humanists, insofar as they place a lot of faith and value on the potential for humanity to be an ultimate good and to be capable of self-governance. They believe the death of someone who is oppressive would prevent the death of innocents, and thus will engage in assassinations of choice targets. The Templars, conversely, are more authoritarian in nature. They believe that humanity is inherently base, animalistic, and incapable of choosing its own destiny. They believe that there must be a certain power structure at the top, pulling the strings to promote peace and order in society. They believe that free will is an illusion, and a world government of some sort is the only way that society will ever properly flourish and obtain tranquility. The story of creation. The best place to start with Assassin's Creed is its origin story. To best summarize the story of creation in Assassin's Creed would be to label it as Gnostic and Luciferian. Gnosticism was an early Christian heresy defined by the idea that its adherents had special, hidden knowledge that others did not possess. Without this hidden knowledge, salvation was not attainable for the Gnostics. To begin, the gods of the Assassin's Creed universe are the Isu, or the ones who came before, also known as the first civilization. They created humans in their image for the sole purpose of serving their masters. Adam and Eve were the first two humans created by the Isu, and also the ones to rebel upon their own volition. This contrasts from the Christian perspective that Adam and Eve were created pure, free of sin, and that the external influence of Lucifer was the one who enticed them to disobey God in the Garden of Eden. Here, Adam and Eve took it upon themselves to say what is right and what is wrong, independent of their creators. They deemed themselves fit to rebel against what they saw as wrong, morally evil, and to be the architects of their own fate, as Ezio would put it. This is what makes it humanist. The idea that humans are the moral arbiters. They can properly determine the right and wrong of this universe. As we know from the biblical story of creation, as well as the last 2,000 years of Christian theology, and simply by living our lives, we know that human beings are fallen beings who trend towards sin. This sort of revolutionary slant on creation's origins is in line with Luciferianism, since both stories twist the traditional understanding to say that the ones who rebelled were inherently righteous. They were the guardians of the so-called freedom they sought. Lucifer did not wish to serve man, as God created angels to serve man, and so in turn, Adam and Eve chose to overthrow their Isu masters to better serve their own interests. It is also worth noting that in Gnosticism, the Demiurge, or the so-called God of the Old Testament, created the world and is the mean, evil God colloquially referred to. Jesus Christ is the, quote, good God of the New Testament, and is supposedly the one who provides secret knowledge to his adherents to obtain salvation. The parallels are undeniable with Adam and Eve and the Isu story of creation, as well as the Gnostic and Luciferian stories of creation. Biblical attacks. Perhaps the most overt attacks on Christendom lie within how the series puts its own spin on Jesus Christ and other biblical figures. This sort of slanderous behavior goes all the way back to the very first game, with Altair and his mentor, Al-Mualim.
Do you understand now? The Red Sea was never parted. Water never turned to wine. It was not the machinations of Eris that spawned the Trojan War, but this! Illusions! All of them!
For those who are unaware, the piece of Eden Al-Mualim was using against Altair in the clip is an Isu artifact. It gives the wielder power over the mind and body of his enemies, as well as telling its user of the hidden knowledge of the universe, another Gnostic element in this series. Altair would go on to hold the same Apple of Eden for 7 decades, learning the origins of the universe, future technology, and how to kill his enemies with their own weapons. Jesus Christ's miracles were nothing more than an illusion in this game. Christ's works on earth were not his own, but rather the machinations of a piece of Eden that he got his hands on. In fact, Assassin's Creed 2 goes even further than its predecessor to say that Jesus Christ failed to even rise from the dead. Instead, the apostles tried to raise him from the dead and outright failed to do so. All the miracles Jesus performed, as the game's story would have us believe, were nothing more than manipulation of the mind and made possible by a piece of Eden. Who is to say that Jesus wasn't manipulating the minds of the apostles and his disciples during his ministry on earth? What are the implications upon his ministry and upon Christians when we bear this fact in mind? The prophet Moses, the main figure of the book of Exodus, is not spared from Ubisoft's tirade against the faith. As is widely known, the prophet Moses was the man that God chose to lead his chosen people, the Jews, out of Egypt and from their slavery. The Pharaoh fought against Moses for the longest time before finally relenting and allowing Moses to take his people. However, Pharaoh had a change of heart and pursued the Jewish people with his soldiers on horseback and in chariots. Moses and the Jews were stuck on the shore of the Red Sea, where the Lord told Moses to tap the ground with a staff. Upon doing so, the Red Sea split apart and gave the Jewish people a way to cross the sea safely. Every single person made it to the other side, and Pharaoh tried his best to do the same. However, Moses restored the water back to its original state with the Pharaoh and his men still crossing it. Needless to say, they drowned. Ubisoft, however, has a more creative way of explaining God's miracles in this game series. Instead, Moses' staff itself was a piece of Eden, much like the apple that Al-Mualim and Altair were discussing. It was not God's help, but instead a physical, material object that parted the Red Sea. There was no divine inspiration, but rather Moses having the right tools for the job and nothing more. At one point in time, St. John the Baptist possessed a staff of Eden. It is not known exactly what St. John did with the staff, but it can likely be assumed its manipulative powers were used. Perhaps in the Assassin's Creed universe, St. John was not a prophet in the sense that Christians think. Perhaps he was really a prophet telling the hidden knowledge, or gnosis, that the staff was giving him, much like Altair. As mentioned before, Jesus Christ was never able to perform his miracles on his own. Instead, he possessed a staff, which later fell into the hands of St. Peter, the apostle who would later become the Bishop of Rome. This staff was allegedly passed down through the centuries by the popes. What does this say of the Christian faith? More specifically, the Roman Catholic faith. That Jesus was a fraud, a manipulator of the masses? That the popes of Rome are nothing but con men who manipulate the minds and bodies of others? Power corrupts. That is a common theme in the Assassin's Creed series. Do not be so naive to think that in this universe, with this much power, some of the popes would not be willing to bend the minds of many to serve them for their own goals. Savonarola and the Renaissance. Now is a great time to segue into the Renaissance period. The games surrounding Ezio's life were perhaps the most popular of the series, and thus deserve more focus than others. Perhaps one of the most overt attacks on Christianity in this era were levied against Girolamo Savonarola, an Italian Roman Catholic friar in the late 1400s. Savonarola, like many, had seen the corruption and decadence that had seeped into Catholicism and into society abroad. The people of his home city, Florence, had fallen into all sorts of worldly and sinful ways. It is well known that the Renaissance was a time of self-indulgence, and one need not look further than the problems that existed in Savonarola's immediate world. The Catholics had, in his opinion, adopted pagan and corrupt practices. To touch briefly, the Pope, Rodrigo Borgia, was a proponent of the Medici coup, which involved the murder of political officials. More on that later. The Roman pontiff had also assumed a political position that stretched beyond the mere realm of religiosity. It may be argued that the Roman pontiff was the most powerful man alive in this time period, with entire armies at his disposal. Savonarola also believed that paganism was on the rise in Catholicism with popularized works such as Dante's Inferno, which essentially was a colorful, exaggerated, and outright inaccurate depiction of hell. Hell was depicted as having 9 circles full of various fictional or pagan characters. The description of hell was nothing like that of any traditional Christian understanding. Savonarola also saw the horrors and the sorts of artistic pursuits by the church and her clergy. A famous example is Donatello's sculpture of King David, depicting him as youthful, feminine, and nude. Clergy and laity alike were commissioning works of a nude and lustful nature. Bare skin was in vogue. Seeing all this within the Catholic Church, as well as a general decline in people's moral dignity, Savonarola began to preach openly against the problems he saw. He began what was known as the bonfire of the vanities. He thought this was a way of fixing the problem. The point was to burn anything that Savonarola felt was a vanity, such as sinful books, art, and going as far as to desire mirrors to be burned. Savonarola and his followers would go on to even exile, beat, or kill dissidents of his movement. I will not comment on whether Savonarola was theologically correct. He did, however, admit under torture that he had made up his prophecies, but recanted and confessed these multiple times. He also claimed that he would be able to walk through fire, and he never did such a thing. Many considered him to be a proto-Protestant, a forerunner of the Reformation, due to his attacks against the Roman Catholic Church. The main focus of Savonarola will be the fact that Ubisoft, yet again, refused to pass up an opportunity to portray a Christian leader as deranged and wicked. It is the fact that Savonarola had to use the apple of Eden to convince his followers, unlike the real-life man who was able to win over the hearts and minds of others through his genuine charisma and persuasion. What could be more unchristian than refusing his fellow man their own free will? Is it really so awful that a priest would try to take care of the souls of his home city and call them to repentance? In fact, Ezio assassinates a priest who is simply preaching repentance in the game, albeit with the tacked-on addendum that he believes Savonarola is a prophet and a great man. It is outright disturbing that Ezio admits that many of Savonarola's followers are under a sort of mind control, but chooses to kill them for their actions while under the apple's influence. While hearing his target's final words, he will sometimes tell them that they are not entirely at fault for what they did. Some of his targets claim they don't know what came over them, or they do not even remember some of what they had done.
Your mind, since it is your own.
Not all of us require deception to be convinced. I already believed. All I said is true. What have I done?
Your actions were not your own.
But they were. My own self-doubt let him hold me as he did. I am sorry.
As am I.
What have I done?
You tried to force devotion.
Sometimes the people must be told what to think.
No good has ever come of that.
I thought he preached the word of God.
I fear his sermon is a lie.
I led my flock astray. It's just I wanted so badly to believe.
We all do.
So if the assassins are all about absolute freedom and the right of the individual to choose their own destiny, why has Ezio held several men accountable for things they were not truly culpable of doing? Is this the message Ubisoft is trying to tell its players? That it's okay to hold someone accountable for things they did not do? The Assassin's Creed says to stay one's blade away from the flesh of an innocent. Can it not be said that those under Savonarola's mind control were innocent of their doings to some degree? Could Ezio have prevented needless death by simply taking the apple from Savonarola, or by simply killing him first and foremost instead of taking out his lackeys? This was the most sickening part of my research, to be fully honest. The Borgias. With Savonarola taken care of, it's time to talk about the Ezio trilogy's biggest villain, Rodrigo Borgia, also known as Pope Alexander VI. Rodrigo was perhaps the most infamous pope in all of history due to his corruption, flaunting of papal doctrine, and being the face of the Italian Templars for the greater part of 3 decades. Born in 1431 in modern-day Spain, Rodrigo Borgia was the nephew of Pope Callistus III and quickly became involved in the Catholic Church at the ripe age of 14. With his uncle becoming pope, a young Rodrigo was able to climb the church's ladder through the nepotism that ran rampant in Catholicism during this time period. Rodrigo became a deacon when he was 25 and eventually a cardinal as well. Rodrigo's career in the Catholic Church was entirely focused on obtaining power, namely getting elected pope. He used his family name and other underhanded methods to get what he sought most. One of Rodrigo's nefarious acts as a Catholic deacon and cardinal was when he framed the Auditore family for treason along with his accomplices. This was done because Rodrigo's nemesis, Giovanni Auditore, was an assassin. This was the event that kickstarted the Ezio trilogy when Ezio's father and 2 brothers were executed for crimes they had not committed. In fact, Giovanni tried his best to prove his innocence and asked his son, Ezio, to deliver documents to the local magistrate, Uberto Alberti, that would prove his innocence. It turned out that Uberto was part of the conspiracy and denied ever having received the documents from Ezio. Unfortunately, Ezio's family died before his very eyes. From there on, Ezio sought revenge against Rodrigo. The previously mentioned Medici coup was another example of Rodrigo's character. Rodrigo and his accomplices desired to dethrone the Medici banking family from their powerful position as the head of the Florentine government. The Medici family were secretly allied with the assassins and worked closely with the late Auditore family. This could not stand, and so the Pazzi conspiracy sought to take down the Florentine government so that the Templars may usurp their power. This resulted in the death of Giuliano de' Medici and the failed assassination of his brother Lorenzo. Ezio eventually foiled the conspiracy and sought revenge on the perpetrators. However, the real-life Rodrigo Borgia was never involved in the Pazzi conspiracy. At best, the Borgias were distant friends with the Pazzis. What does this say of Ubisoft that they must further demonize a man who already had plenty of material to convince most of his ill repute? Was it not enough to show Rodrigo as he really was? Of course not. Ubisoft had to take a low-hanging fruit like Rodrigo Borgia and use him to further demonize the Catholic Church as an institution professing Christianity. By 1492, Rodrigo Borgia had become Pope Alexander VI. Ezio traveled to Rome in 1499 with the goal of assassinating the Pope. Upon arriving, Ezio dove onto Rodrigo from the rafters and tried to assassinate him. As mentioned before, the popes all possessed the Staff of Eden. Luckily for Rodrigo, he used that very staff to resist Ezio. Ezio was able to resist Rodrigo's mind control because Ezio had his own Apple of Eden. Possessing one cancels out the other is the simplest way of explaining it. In their final showdown, Rodrigo tells Ezio about the vault that is beneath the Sistine Chapel. He goes into great detail about how God dwells within this vault. He only desires to get inside for power alone. That he will use the apple and the staff to defeat God and take his power. He denies the Bible, saying it is written by men. Rodrigo says he does not believe a single word of Scripture, calling it lies and superstition, like all other religious tracts of the past 10,000 years. All of this is an outright slander of the real Rodrigo Borgia's character. There is nothing to suggest that the real man was entirely lacking in faith, or that he did not believe his religion to be true. It is undeniable that Pope Alexander wasn't the most moral or well-behaved of the pontiffs, but it is quite a stretch to say all of this of his own person. After all, He grew up in a heavily Catholic Spain in Italy in a time before the Enlightenment. Such notions of agnosticism or atheism were not codified yet. When Ezio enters the vault after defeating the Pope, he meets Minerva, one of the Isu, a quote, god from the first civilization. She relays a message of how humans were created in her people's image to serve them, and that they ultimately rebelled against the Isu. A war broke out, and the humans drove the Isu into extinction. What Ezio is speaking to is really Minerva's phantom. She is one of the true, canonical deities of this game's universe. To further the point, what does it say of Roman Catholicism in the Assassin's Creed universe? They would create a vault that houses Minerva and the Isu beneath the Sistine Chapel. Why would the Catholics do such a thing? Are the top brass secretly aware that their religion is a falsehood? Or that perhaps their religion is a fragment of the Isu's whole truth? Whatever the case may be, they are quite damaging against the Roman Catholics and Christians as a whole in the Assassin's Creed series. The reason I covered Savonarola and Rodrigo Borgia are clear. Ubisoft uses easy targets of what some would consider to be, quote, bad Catholics, to further their goals of spreading a message that Christendom is somehow wrong, flawed, or outright evil at worst. Detractors may argue that this is simply how the Templars behave, that they exist at all times, in all places, that they are simply trying to gain control through the legitimate power structures of the region. The Roman Catholic Church was undoubtedly a vehicle of political, religious, social, and economic power in the Renaissance, and nobody would deny this. However, it is the black and white approach that really betrays Ubisoft's true intentions. There is virtually little to no positive representation of Catholics or Christians in general in the Ezio trilogy. The closest one would find would be Teodoro Contanto, a nun who opened her own brothel. This woman is only seen as a hero because she is a member of the Italian Brotherhood. What does this say of the Italian assassins? That they value so-called freedom to engage in carnal pleasures? That they are willing to kill those that would call others to repentance? That they disregard religion for the sake of their so-called truth? Was it not Ezio who said earlier that society is fragile and that it must be closely guarded? Why assassinate those who are arguably innocent and glorify things like sexual immorality that would lead to the decline of a fragile society? Shouldn't the assassins help free the masses of the control the Pope clearly asserts over others through fear and the literal abrogation of free will? How much more on the nose can one be? Furthermore, why does Ubisoft have to fabricate details about a man who is already cartoonishly evil to prove their hidden point that Christianity is immoral or wrong? Why can they not simply use the historical facts at hand about Rodrigo Borgia and Savonarola? Why must they resort to them using things like mind control and controlling the bodies of others? Why must they let their storylines ride on mere rumors, like Rodrigo's son and daughter being in an incestuous relationship? Ubisoft wanted to use the Renaissance papacy and Catholicism in general as an easy jumping-off point to slander Christianity. Constantinople. The last game focused on Ezio, as well as the last major section of this video. We'll be talking about Ezio's final game in the series, Assassin's Creed Revelations. In this game, it is now 1511, and Ezio is the mentor of the assassins. He is at the top of the ladder, much like Rodrigo was in his own organization. Ezio travels to Constantinople, otherwise known as Istanbul, to find the 5 Masyaf keys as they are called. These keys will unlock a secret library Altair built and hid under the Masyaf Keep you see in the first game. It is here that a great, important knowledge was hidden away. Niccolo and Mafio Polo had a brief stay with Altair in the mid-13th century, and upon Altair's request, hid these 5 keys deep within the city of Constantinople. It is paramount to note that this game is probably one of the biggest offenders in the series of historical revisionism, bending facts, and flying in the face of Christendom. This game would make Al-Mualim from the first game blush. I, myself, am an Eastern Orthodox Christian, so this section was by far the most personal for me. This game took place in what was once the Byzantine Empire's great capital of Constantinople, which had an Orthodox ethos so strong that it seeped into every aspect of their livelihood, from the serfs all the way to the emperor himself. There was a touch of the church in every corner of life that was markedly different than how the Roman Catholics were in the West. That is a topic for another time. After the tutorial, where Ezio visits Masyaf Keep in the brutal winter and fighting off the Byzantine remnants who just so happened to be Templars, he learns of the Masyaf keys that were whisked away to Constantinople. The assassin mentor makes no delay in pursuing his goal, arriving a couple of weeks later in Constantinople's Galata district. Ezio meets Yusuf Tazim, the leader of the Turkish assassins. The two take a tour of the district, and Ezio learns there is a fledgling group of Byzantines loyal to the late emperor's vision. Yusuf also explains that the Byzantine Templars have a strong control over the city the game takes place in. The Byzantines were outright repressive to the assassins, and they saw their numbers dwindle under their rule. Conversely, however, the Ottomans arrived in 1453 and took over the city. Under the Ottomans, the assassins flourished and experienced great relief. Yusuf stressed they weren't best buddies with the Ottomans, but the Ottomans were quite tolerant of their presence. The assassins forged a shaky bond with the Ottomans, and Yusuf joked that, unlike the Byzantines, the Ottomans will, quote, feel bad for killing the assassins later. It's worth mentioning that Ezio and his allies refer to the Byzantines and Templars as one and the same interchangeably. So much so, it is supposed to conjure up images of both when one or the other are mentioned. There is a lot wrong with all of this. First and foremost, the Ottomans toppled the Byzantine Empire in 1453 when they conquered Constantinople. By that point in time, the Byzantines were a mere splinter of what they once were. The Byzantines had a few remnants who held out against the Ottomans, but they did not last longer than the 1460s. It's also important to point out the fact that Ubisoft made the Byzantines into Templars, and how this is laughable. The Byzantines and the Templars have an incredibly rocky history. The Templars massacred the Byzantines in the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Christians attacked Christians. The Catholic Templars and the Crusaders arrived in Constantinople, slaughtered everything that moved, violated women, even nuns, on the altars of Orthodox churches, and raided the tombs of the dead. It was said that the Crusaders opened a tomb, were the first to bear witness to a saint's body having been incorrupt, or having had little to no decay after decades or even centuries. And they still grave robbed him after witnessing this great miracle from God. It was so bad that it is said the Crusaders took $100 million in today's money from the city. Word reached the Pope, who was utterly aghast and excommunicated everyone involved in this horrible incident. To briefly touch on it, the Latin captivity was a 60-year period when the Byzantine Empire was ruled by the Latins who had invaded in 1204. Society was rearranged briefly around a more constitutional structure, Latin was spoken, and Eastern Catholicism was impressed upon society. Eventually, the Orthodox took their city back in 1261. With all this in mind, it is frankly silly to think that the Templars would make their home in Constantinople 250 years after they were driven out by the Orthodox Emperor. Ubisoft has an odd habit of placing the assassins into a situation where two factions are warring at one another and deciding that the group who is more Christian or status quo are the ones to be Templars. This can be seen throughout the series. The Ottomans and the Byzantine Templars, the US and the English Templars. Most recently in Valhalla, the player plays as a Viking assassin who is helping pillage St. Alfred's Wessex, who just so happens to be the man who founded the Templars and a Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox saint. Back to Revelations. The Ottomans were objectively less moral than the Byzantines were any day of the week. This game is not subtle in its endorsement of the Ottoman Empire as the, quote, right choice for the assassins to ally with. A great example is the Byzantines' religious freedom versus the Ottomans' own system. The Byzantines were tolerant of religion, allowing one to practice whatever religion they wished to, so long as their beliefs did not inherently undermine the well-being of society. In fact, after the Emperor St. Justinian's rule, the Byzantines became quite tolerant of Jews. This was a rare thing throughout history, seeing how Jews were frequently expelled throughout Europe for centuries. Conversely, the Ottomans pressured conversion to Islam through force or jizya, or a tax that non-Muslims must pay for refusing to convert. If the jizya was not paid, then the penalty would be death if one still refused converting. The Ottomans also had a rather strange and heartless approach to breeding janissaries. The janissary was their most elite soldier, much like a Roman praetorian. The Ottomans would forcibly conscript Balkan boys as young as 6 to be taken from their Christian families. Once in custody, the boys would be converted to Islam, circumcised, taught Turkish, and groomed to be the most elite soldiers of the empire. Which group, to you, sounds like they would value the freedom that the assassins seek after? The right for society to choose their own path and destiny? Which group is more repressive and in line with Templar thought of controlling society to achieve their own goals and a so-called peace? Of course, it is not hard to see that Ubisoft would choose to have the assassins side with a group who aren't of a Christian ethos. This should be no surprise after exploring their attitude towards Renaissance Catholicism. Ezio arrives in Constantinople and immediately forges alliances with the Ottomans, purely because their interests align. He gets close with men such as Pililaeus, one of the top commanders of the Ottoman Navy. He helps Ezio with things such as navigation and a few inside tips on the Ottomans. Another example is a young Suleiman, the crown prince of the Ottoman Empire. He is merely a 17-year-old, and his role as Sultan was yet to come. Ezio discovers a Byzantine Templar attempt to revolt against the Ottomans and retake Constantinople. The perpetrator is Manuel Palaiologos, the nephew of the late Emperor Constantine Palaiologos XI. Ezio learned from a janissary, Tariq Barleti, that the Templars operated out of Cappadocia. Following the lead, Pililaeus took Ezio there by boat. Ezio arrived in Cappadocia, where he confirmed Barletti's lead. Indeed, this large city within a cave was the base of operations for the Templars. They had moved in there at some point and installed their own guards, using the fort in one part of the cave city as their headquarters for the Byzantine Rite Templars to carry out their orders. In an attempt to flush out Manuel, Ezio committed one of his most atrocious acts in his career as an assassin. There was a large deposit of gunpowder in the fort's depot, which Ezio blew up and caused a massive ash cloud to fill the city. Manuel chastised Ezio for ruining the lives of innocent civilians, and he might actually have a point for once. After all, this was a Cappadocian city that was merely occupied by the Templars. Ubisoft does not say one way or another if every single person in this city is an avowed Templar agent. Gameplay would suggest otherwise, since there are innocent civilians carrying out their lives. In the end, Ezio assassinates Manuel and claims the last Masyaf key from him. On the way out of the city, Ezio has to experience the hell he has created for a city of innocents. The smoke is thick, hard to see through, and the player can hear people coughing non-stop. People are struggling to escape the city, and many are suffering from smoke inhalation. Ezio, of course, escapes untouched, as one would expect from the protagonist. Imagine how much destruction Ezio had caused upon the city. There was only one entrance and exit to the city, and hundreds, if not thousands of people lived within. This sort of mass hysteria would create a stampede, and people undoubtedly would have trampled one another to death trying to get to safety. Smoke inhalation causes irritation and illness. Too much will lead to suffocation and death. In the long run, if severe enough, someone could develop medical conditions like throat and lung cancer as a result of breathing such toxic substances. None of this is explored or shown in great detail, but it's something that one could infer with some common sense. Once again, we have seen Ezio has failed to protect the innocent in his goal of fighting against the Templars. He's nothing more than a murderous fanatic. Revelations was the final Ezio game, and perhaps one of the most well-received, for how deep, touching, emotional, and gritty it was compared to prior entries. However, despite how loved it was by myself and others, It also shows the pattern of disdain for Christianity in any form it appears in. Despite all this being said, I still adore certain aspects of this series. The music is an obvious starting point, as well as the atmosphere, the architecture, and the multiplayer mode each game offered. This series helped me foster a love for history, even if it had to twist or exaggerate details for its narrative. There's a large piece of me that will always have some sort of appreciation for this series. I spent probably close to 1,000 hours on the multiplayer mode alone, as well as playing it with my close friends in high school. My grandmother used to watch me run across the rooftops of Constantinople not too long before she passed away. This video serves as a warning to current or prospective fans of the series that Ubisoft has some things to answer for with their Christian audience. At best, this series has a coincidental slant against Christianity because it chose to focus on societies that were based on Christian values. At worst, everything I have laid out in this video is willful, intentional, and malicious, with the desire to defame Christ and His church. Anyone who plays these games ought to take heed, as we are warned that inviting sinful or evil things into our homes and lives will also invite the demons and further sin into our lives. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did writing the script and putting it together. May God bless you, keep you, and save us all. Thank you for watching. And thank you to everybody who helped me put this together.